Hi everyone, welcome to the first in our operational resilience video series. I'm Dan Waltham, one of the directors at Fourth Line, and I'm joined by Chris Moran, who's a senior manager and engagement lead in Fourth Line's resilience consulting function. Hi Chris.
Hi Dan.
We are going to talk today on the subject of metrics and aggregation, which is a topic that we're encountering across many conversations, client conversations and engagements at this time. So let's dive straight in with the question. What are some of the challenges and considerations for operational resilience metrics and aggregation design? Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Dan. So I think the best place to start when looking at metrics is by defining what it is you are trying to achieve. A lot of firms have started off with the IBS mapping and gone down that route. And only when they get to the reporting requirement do they actually look at, well, what are we reporting against? If we don't know what the target state is, how can you identify where you are in relation to that point? So that definition of target state will take the form of attributes, let's call it, of the underlying resources. So it may be tests that they've performed, it may be certain standards that they've achieved, it may be a certain contractual clauses in the event of third parties, whatever those list of attributes that you think is relevant to your firm and is appropriate given your size and proportionality, in order to best measure the risk associated with that resource type. Once you've done that, obviously you can build those into controls, and that helps with the second sort of most obvious challenge, which is actually finding appropriate data to articulate the current state. We've seen a lot of firms where they had good operational practices, but they are not generating sufficient data points that can then be used to objectively report on the resilience of their current state. So that's sort of a key one, is making sure that your BAU processes are generating that information that you can then aggregate and pass up the chain. Some of the firms that we've dealt with have also struggled with the manual production of some of the reporting. Depending on the complexity of your data model and the data sources, it can take a long time to pull the information together and to get it into a format where it relates directly to the important business service. Obviously, as the programs move into business as usual, this becomes a repeating requirement, and that can significantly impact both the quality and quantity of the reporting that's available to you. Along with obviously the time to create that report, it also extends the gap between when that data was created, when it was accurate, and potentially the point at which the overall reporting makes it in front of your senior stakeholders for them to make informed decisions. So you're extending that gap between what the stakeholder sees and the point in time at which potentially the reporting was produced, potentially undermining the value of the report at the end point. And lastly, when it comes to aggregation, so ultimately you're trying to get a sense of or answer the question for your stakeholders, which is, are we as resilient as we want to be? And where we are not as resilient as we want to be, what are we doing about it? So the aggregation should support ultimately that build up to being able to answer those questions. So for a resource, is it as resilient as we want it to be? Is that 5 measures of resilience? Is it 2 measures of resilience? And then factor in things like risk weighting or priorities depending on risk appetite, and ultimately it is a risk appetite decision as to how these red, amber, green statuses are created and what level of aggregation or models that you use. It is absolutely imperative, however, that obviously once you've created all of these aggregation models, that the end stakeholders understand exactly how those models work, and therefore what do they actually see when it's put in front of them. Do they understand it? Do they know what it is telling them, and especially what it is not telling them about the level of resilience in the organization?
Great, thanks, Chris. I think a question from me there in terms of the weighting and aggregation piece. Do you have a sense of what best practice is in terms of the number of metrics that should go into some sort of aggregation model? We've spoken with firms that are looking to aggregate upwards of 10 different metrics, and that just feels like a headache.
I think there isn't a definitive right answer. I think the number of measures that you should be looking at should be a conscious decision based on the important business services that your firm offers and the potential risk it exposes the customers and the market to. So if you have higher risk important business services, for example, with shorter impact tolerances, you would expect the governance to be a bit more stringent. So you'd expect more metrics or more measures of resilience for those sorts of firms. For firms where you've got significantly greater flexibility, let's say, within your impact tolerances, you can use less metrics. In terms of the weighting, we've seen quite a lot of firms putting weighting on the recovery disciplines, so your business continuity and your IT disaster recovery type capabilities within the metrics, mainly because obviously that's the most understood and the more mature programs that develop those capabilities. And it's obviously the last line of defense from a resilience perspective. Personally, I think the actual weighting should be pushed more towards preventative measures, but that is certainly something that you can build into the maturity of your program as and when better metrics and data become available.
Great, thank you. And last slide here, we have an example of a template that a firm might use for a board or Risco report. Can you just talk us through that, please?
Yeah, so the purpose of, as I mentioned in the beginning, the purpose of the reporting is to try and get across an understanding to the stakeholder of how resilient, in this particular case, an important business service is, given the amount of data that's involved in that statement. I would definitely suggest a sort of exceptions reporting process, which focuses far more on the gaps than necessarily just highlighting everything that's gone into the report, certainly when you get it up to board level. But in this particular instance, we're pulling out key pieces of information, which is what is the important business service about, what's its current testing status, is there a trend, a downward or negative trend within the resilience of that application across the month, across the last quarter. What does it currently look like? Again, we've got red, amber, greens there in terms of where should the IBS owner be focusing their attention, or where should they be concerned. And at the bottom there, we're looking at open risk actions. So actually, for all those reds and ambers, what actions are already in flight to remediate, what things are already being tracked and under governance, and are they going to deliver on time in a meaningful way? I think it's important to realise that for the vast majority of firms, their important business services are never going to be 100% resilient. You're likely to see reds across your reporting. I think from a cultural perspective, it's really important that that's acceptable. The whole purpose of the resilience program is to identify problems and escalate them so that people can make informed decisions rather than just presenting good news and then potentially get blindsided by things that you weren't looking for or that you weren't tracking appropriately.
Great, thank you. And watch this space for a video short on resilience culture in a week or so's time. Great, thank you, Chris. Yeah, and thanks all. Goodbye.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.